Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So excited to be together with everyone again for the last day in a wonderful series of learning that we've been engaged in for, over a month now. And just want to first of all, thank you so much for spending your time this afternoon with us and honoring us with your presence. I will go ahead and introduce our session shortly, but I definitely want to begin by giving honor to to those who made it possible for today. So let me go ahead and get us started there. Welcome to the last day of the CAAASA UCLA CCEE Advancing Equity in an Era of Crisis webinar series. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, CAAASA, and the University of California, Los Angeles Center for the Transformation of Schools put this project together to support equity in virtual learning as we all shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This work has been made possible by the generous support of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE. We are grateful for their partnership on behalf of California's K-12 public school students. And so today, you are here obviously during the live session. At the end of today's session, I will be putting a link in the chat so that you will be able to complete a survey for today's session. Even though today is the last day, we really hope that you will still answer the survey because it's really important to us to be responsive to your thoughts and ideas and questions. And even though today is the last day of the series, it's not the last opportunity that we'll have to engage in learning with one another. So we definitely want to have your feedback. So I'll put the survey link in the chat at the end. Additionally, we're going to have time today for you to ask questions during the session, but if for any reason you don't have your question answered today, or you think about today's session after we're done and you have additional questions, you'll receive a link in the chat also to the Ask the Experts portal. So you'll be able to submit your questions there and have someone with knowledge of the topic that you're asking about to respond to you within 48 hours. And then additionally, at the end, I'll give you a link to the website where you'll be able to find the recording from today's session, as well as any resources that are shared. And then so now I want to go ahead and talk about today's session, but just before we do that, I want to let you know that as we engage in the session, when you look in the chat, you'll see an option to send questions or comments through to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. Please send to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your questions and your comments, and especially if you share resources for the group. And so just to let you know about today's session, we're so excited we're going to be hearing today from Dr. Pedro Noguera. We'll be hearing from Dr. Daryl Camp and also from Sujie Shin. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll tell you what the name of the session is, and then I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Camp to introduce everyone. And we also will be hearing from Tony Thurmond a little bit later in the session, so he'll come in toward the end. But today's session is Preparing Students for the Future, Addressing COVID-19, Distance Learning, and Racial Justice. So Dr. Camp, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Please know everyone, I'll be here looking in the chat, and we would love for you to submit your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to share those questions with our facilitators. I'll give it to you now, Dr. Camp.
Thank you, Africa. Really appreciate it. I'm not going to take too long with the introductions because I really want to get into the topic at hand. And I know when this webinar series was originally discussed, we were thinking about the COVID-19 crisis, and even before then, what could we do to bring value to the field as CAAASA? And then through the generous donation, not donation, but the sponsorship of the CCEE, we were able to make this happen. And I hope, just looking at the attendance that we've had over the last 4 or 5 weeks, it certainly seems like there are a lot of people that have been interested in the topic. And we're just thrilled that we're able to make it work with CCE support, the Center for Transformation of Schools, just the San Diego County Office of Education. It's been a partnership, and we're proud of that. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, if you've ever been to a CAAASA convening, you know that CAAASA recognizes that it's a partnership. CAAASA has been extremely strategic and purposeful about bringing all of our stakeholders to the table in order to have a conversation to support our students. In a sense, we recognize that it really and truly does take a village in order to support our students and to get the educational outcomes that we want for all of our students, and especially and unapologetically African American students. So what you'll see today is a conversation of some of our partners, CCEE, you'll see researchers, and that's Dr. Noguera, who's he's legendary in the field of education and the research that he's done. You'll see a political aspect in Tony Thurmond, who's served in the state assembly for a number of years before he was elected to be the state superintendent of public instruction. And then myself, I'm definitely a current practitioner as I serve as the superintendent in the San Lorenzo Unified School District. So with that, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. And I know we're talking about COVID-19, but obviously I tell people we had the crisis before the crisis before the crisis, right? The original crisis was, or is, when you look at the student achievement of our students, in particular brown and black students, African-American students, Latinx or Latino students, we had a crisis. And then we had COVID-19 and that crisis. And then the recent killings of unarmed African-Americans highlighted another crisis that we have. So there's so many crises out there. And I know this conversation, you can't just separate one crisis from the other. They all go together to create very difficult learning circumstances for our students. And candidly, our adults too. Our adults are experiencing trauma right along with the students with all these three crises that are here. So I'm going to introduce Sujie Shin. Sujie Shin is the Deputy Executive Director for the CCEE, or the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. She's known as a researcher. She oversees the agency's operations and the research and evaluation initiatives for the agency. Her prior work involved being a co-director of research for standards assessment and accountability services at West Ed. She also has served in a similar type of role with the National Center on Standards and Assessment Implementation. Previously, she served as the Deputy Chief of Assessment and Accountability for the District of Columbia Public Schools, and she has also held educational assessment and research positions in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. She began, I want to say, I don't know if she began, but she also served as a teacher in the Norwood Elementary School District in Los Angeles. And CC, once again, is here today representing the CCEE. And then after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Noguera. And Dr. Noguera needs no introduction, of course. He is currently the faculty director for the Center for the Transformation of Schools at UCLA. Next year, he will be a dean with the Rozier School of Education. So he'll be making the move from Bruin land to Trojan land. And he's been a commentator on such news agencies as CNN and MSNBC, NPR, National Public Radio. He's an author of many different publications. I just remember I pulled this off my shelf. He probably remembers this, read this entirely. But if I brought in all of his literature that he's written, my office will be filled right now, so I couldn't do all that. With that, I say welcome. Thanks for Sujie and for Dr. Noguera for being with us. We are expecting Tony Thurmond to come in and participate later on, and we'll introduce him when he comes on. So Sujie, take it away.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a privilege to be with all of you today. I'm sharing this very critical conversation that we've been engaging in with all of you over the past several weeks with CAAASA and the Center for Transformation of Schools at UCLA. I'm feeling especially privileged to be sharing this virtual stage up here today with Drs. Noguera and Camp. So thank you. The conversation that we're having today is really is around how we prepare our students and ourselves for the future as we delve into the uncertainty that we face today in our schools, in our lives, and the world around us. The multiple crises that Dr. Camp said, that we are facing are unprecedented. It is truly a time of unprecedented, radical uncertainty. And some of us and some of our students bear more of the burden of this than others. And so as we think about how we prepare our students for future in light of COVID-19 and through this lens of equity, I'd like to go back to what Dwight sort of teed us up with in terms of how do we think about this lens of what we know, this first crises around the achievement gap, right? And the opportunity gap and the access gap. And I'd like to highlight some of those pieces today and create a bit of a through line to understand what some of our students are facing. I'm a data person, so bear with me as I walk through some of this context setting for our conversation today for the rest of this hour, through sharing some familiar and perhaps not so familiar pieces of data. I'm going to start here. In 2019, Dr. Sean Reardon at Stanford, you may have heard this study, looked at assessment and demographic data from nearly all the public schools in the US over a period of 8 years to track achievement gaps between students, and found that nearly all of the achievement gap was accounted for by the poverty of the students in the group, as measured by the eligibility and free and reduced lunch program. Now, we know in our country today, race and socioeconomic status are inextricably intertwined. But when we think about the statistical fact that the achievement gap is the result of the poverty of the schools that students attend, what does it mean then for our students when we look at our schools across the country and see that as a percentage, as the percentage of Black and Latino students goes up in schools, so does the percentage of the students who are poor. I mean, exponentially as you look at that curve there, meaning that the schools in our country who serve students of color are also overwhelmingly poor, right? Now, tying that back to where we talked about in terms of what accounts for this achievement gap. Looking at it another way, Black students are twice as likely as white students to attend a high poverty school, right? And Black students are more than 5 times as likely as white students to attend a school that is highly segregated by race and ethnicity. And that Black students, when you tie this together, are more than 7 times as likely as white students to attend the school that is both high poverty and highly segregated. So we know our students that are Black students are much more likely than their white or other race counterparts to be in highly segregated, high poverty schools, right? And now once they're in those schools, how are they perceived in those schools? One measure of perception manifests itself in disciplinary data. And a 2017 study found that suspension rates have decreased overall as we have nationally been engaged in this conversation about reducing out of school suspensions. But Black high school students are still twice as likely to be suspended as white Hispanic high school students, and that students with a disability are twice as likely to be suspended as those without a disability. And this disparity in the perception of and reaction to our Black students begins really early. This graph shows a comparison of that makeup of preschool enrollment there on the left versus the percentage of students who are suspended out of school multiple times. Now, again, we're talking about preschool here. White students make up 43% of our preschool classrooms, but only 26% of those who are suspended multiple times. Are white students, as compared with our Black students down there in the orange, who make up less than 1 in 5, or 1 in 5 of our preschool population, but almost half of those who are being suspended. Now, our laws regarding out of school suspensions for our youngest students have changed, but early studies are still showing the same disproportionate disciplinary actions are being meted out towards Black students within the classroom. So they're not being suspended, but they're still receiving that same disparity in terms of the disciplinary actions that they're receiving. And again, I'm talking about disparities that begin as soon as they enter the classroom. These are 3 and 4-year-olds that we're talking about. And the current protests, as I think about this, are evidence of the fact that these patterns of disproportionate perception and reactions to our students follows our students out of school and into the streets with deadly consequences, right? As Daryl sort of started this conversation about this second crisis that we're facing in terms of what this looks like for our students here. Now we talk about, COVID-19. COVID-19 has also had disparate impacts on our students as well. In general, just this one slide here to share, to showcase the fact that African Americans overall make up 13% of the US population, but almost a quarter of the deaths where race was identified, right? Meaning that African Americans are dying at a rate that's nearly twice as high as what their population share would be. And so this is what our students and all of us are carrying into our classrooms and our schools as we're now having this conversation about reopening, whatever that means and however we're doing it. So let's take this into our classrooms. With the stay-at-home orders over the past 3 months or so, most of our schools turned to distance learning for instruction, which in most cases relied on virtual learning through the internet. And when we look at the percentage of students who reported having access to the internet, we see that we're not necessarily reaching all of our students. We're reaching most of them, but remember that even with 94% of our students, that 6% who don't have internet we're talking about millions of students across the country. And then when we you see here that there are disparate rates of access, even at this level. When we talk about, 81% of our Hispanic Latino students, 80% of those students who are American Indian, Native Alaskan having access at all. And then when we take a look at those who are only able to access the internet through their smartphones, right? So of these who say that they have some internet access at home, you look at those who kind of only have access to their smartphones, and you see those disparities widen even further. And so we're talking about 70%, less than 3/4 of our Latino, Hispanic, our Pacific Islander, American Indian, Native students having access. And look what that means. We're talking about millions of students who don't have the accessibility and the resources to access virtual learning. This gap for our brown and Black students in terms of access, as we're talking about this, is huge. So what do we do as educators? As with anything that's challenging, I think we know that there's no silver bullet to any of this. We know that there continues to be incredibly hard and difficult work ahead of us, and we have to be deliberate in how we are addressing this. First, I know that this is something that Dr. Noguera and Pedro, I've heard you say a million times. Social-emotional supports are foundational to what we need. These are incredibly stressful times. And in these stressful times, we need to ensure that our students and our staff feel safe, physically and emotionally, and that we are creating these spaces for themselves and for each other. That we need to ensure that we're building on our relationships with students and with each other, to be deliberate in continuing to make those connections. That we've got to build in that time to check in with our students. Our connected time may be limited now as we move into whatever phases we have of teaching and learning, but we have to use some of that time to continue to build on the relationships. That's going to be critical. Students will not be able to learn without having those foundational needs met. We have to continue to really be deliberate about how we provide social emotional support, building on that growth mindset, and that focuses on student development through experience. How do we provide opportunities to be creative and collaborative? And all of those, the safety, the belonging, the social emotional supports, then set up the framework and the grounds for being able to provide academic challenge, which is just as critical, but not possible without those foundational needs of safety, connectedness, and support being met. And I want to just kind of take a moment there and say that this is, again, not just for our students, but this also it applies to how we're approaching this ourselves as educators, learning new things, learning new ways of teaching and learning new ways of connecting with our students in this context. Second, we need to really make sure that we're creating content with access in mind. How can we be deliberate in applying the kind of principles for universal design for learning in the distance learning space to make sure that we're creating multiple pathways for engaging, for learning and expressing learned content. I think we need to be really deliberate in thinking about what platforms, what media we choose in order for students to choose where it's possible. Thinking about how we provide asynchronous learning opportunities that students can engage with content at their own pace, and then use you and use us as the educators to dive in deeper, provide more structured or individualized follow-up and support. Offering different ways of displaying that content through different media, text, video, sound, text-based, making sure that something's not inaccessible just because it's only available on video or only available through text, to both teach and assess learning. And that remembering that this is not about jumping back in to replicate what our classroom day looked like just online, that lessons and activities will need to be shorter. We need to make sure that we're building in more breaks ourselves and providing students with more opportunities to disconnect and be physical, especially for our younger students. They are right now being inundated with information, emotions, stressors, as are we as educators. And this is going to keep them and us from being able to engage with new learning or to access already learned information effectively. And then just finally, I think we need to take a breath and make sure that we're being deliberate in keeping our connections with each other. You know, this work is hard, and we need to make sure that we're staying connected in order to continue to learn from each other, sharing resources, whether it's templates, activities, lessons, ideas across hallways, grade levels, schools, school systems. I think this is something that CCEE is particularly focused on, and thinking about ways in which we can continue to support, you know, opportunities like this for us to connect, opportunities for systems to connect with each other, to share information, tools, and resources, so that we're not, again, just continuing to rebuild something that already exists, but using our time and energy to focus on providing support to the students who need them. We need to stay connected, both informally and formally, and creating opportunities for ourselves, especially as staff, to make sure that we're connected with each other and with other educators facing the same and different challenges. And finally, creating safe spaces in order to challenge each other to have these difficult conversations in support of our students. You know, I think this is going to be difficult and challenging work. Wanted to kind of tee up as we go into this next phase, you know, again, we'll have these in the handouts, but some resources, there are some really great tools and resources that currently exist out there, both for adults and educators engaging in these conversations, going deeper, you know, whether it's a diversity toolkit for discussing identity, power, and privilege as like staff, a data equity walk toolkit by Ed Trust West to really think about how you use your school or district classroom level data to go in deeper, dig into it, and identify some of those disparities. You know, the anti-racism reading list, a tool, a place where we can collectively identify text to engage with Federal Land as adults. The Smithsonian National Center for African American History and Culture has a portal focused on talking about racism and race issues. ISTE has a COVID-19 educator help desk that is structured around providing technology supports. And then we've worked with our partners to develop a continuity of learning playbook focusing on equity-driven distance and hybrid learning, you know, playbook as we come back online. And then resources to use with students. How do we engage with students K to 12 around these supports and, you know, engaging them at their level to think more deeply about what's happening in the world around them and how we as adults in this space are facilitating these safe but challenging you know, spaces to engage more deeply with the world around them. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you. You know, I think this is the beginning of this conversation.
Yeah, so let's have the conversation. Dr. Noguera, you've done a lot of the research, and you've been a practitioner also. Just give us your perspective. You know the data, the different frames. What's your take on it? You presented a couple of the webinars as well. How is this applicable as people start getting ready to start the 2021 school year? There's a lot of talking going on right now and discussions about what it's going to look like. What are some of the critical aspects as we think about moving into 2021?
So Daryl, let me start by just trying to address some of the issues that Sujie laid out in the opening there. And first I want to talk about the relationship between poverty and achievement, because while it's clear that there's a link, what we don't see is that many of the issues facing kids, and you know, over half of California's kids come from families at or below the poverty level. So that's like most of our kids almost. We haven't addressed the external issues, the issues outside of school. You know, we have very high homeless rates. We have large numbers of kids who are dealing with food insecurity. These issues impact learning. And part of the problem is that we've had an education policy that's focused narrowly on schools and overlooked what's going on outside of schools in the homes where kids live. And this, particularly during the pandemic, has been the big problem. Right now, We're relying on families to educate their kids, working with schools. Many kids are not getting anything at all, including kids whose schools are just sending home work packets. So it's really on the parents to figure out how to serve their kids. And these are the same families in many cases whose parents are essential workers. They're at risk of getting the disease themselves. And so we've exacerbated the inequities that are related to poverty. On top of that, I want to spend a little time on the race issue because, you know, as we've seen with the police murders of black people around the country, and I'm thinking of now, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery by vigilantes. Race confuses many Americans. It confuses them because we're led into believing that this is a problem of a few bad apples in the police department and not looking at systemic violence perpetrated in Black communities across the country, including here in California. And a number of questions have come in already about the role of police in schools. And I know there are a number out there who are also doing restorative practices. The school to prison pipeline is very real. When you look at who we incarcerate, disproportionately it's those we fail to educate. And the process or the experience of criminalization often begins in school, where we see kids with relatively minor behavior infractions who get arrested and start the process of inducting them into the criminal justice system. The cost of that kind of approach is excessive. We pay too much for failure. We are spending too much to incarcerate people and not investing in our schools and in the health of our kids to counter those kinds of, I think, misplaced investments. So it's too bad that Tony Thurmond is not here yet, because he needs to be working with the governor to shift the whole direction of our policy. A number of people have said we need a shift in the paradigm, and that's exactly right. We can't return to normal. We have to return to something much better because we know these disparities that correlate with race and class have been there for many years. And I should point out here, there are lots of schools across California, because I know them well, that have resources that still do a very poor job of educating kids of color. So it's not, we can't just attribute this to poverty. There's more to it than that. We have to look at the climate in those schools. And then I'll add this. We also have to look at where we get success. Right? Because if we look at where Black and Latino kids are succeeding and the schools that consistently produce large numbers of those kids, we see that we have the answer to the problem right there. Right? We did a report focused on LA County, and we identified several schools in LA County that get great outcomes for Black children. And what you see is those kids are getting an enriched education. Those kids have a holistic approach to their education in those schools. Many of the things that Sujie talked about are being implemented there. What we don't do in education is learn from what works. And so we are constantly working in isolation from each other and not learning from the examples around us where we see success being produced.
You know, just associated, piggybacking on what you just said, I'm a big proponent of HBCUs. They're not the only answers, but I do think it's educational malpractice if you don't know about the success of HBCUs. Because here you are, you have over 100 universities, mainly in the South, Southeast, and they are producing results that are disproportionate to the number of African-American students that are going to those institutions. So if you want to find an African-American engineer, where are you more likely to go to? The whole university system in California, CSUs and UCs, or you go to North Carolina A&T. You're going to find more North Carolina A&T at that one school than you will throughout the whole university and CSU system right here in California. I think there's a lesson to be learned there. I mean, I think with the Xavier universities and producing scientists out of there, there's a lesson to be learned. So I tell people, when you look at CNN and you see people like Bakari Sellers, a Morehouse graduate, and you see Frederica Winfield, Howard graduate, what's the commonality, right? I think there's lessons to be learned to even ask the question. So I'm glad that you mentioned finding examples, and I would say we don't have to just limit that to the K through 12 space. It's so critical for us to look and say, boy, these are institutions that have specialized for over 100 years of serving African-American students. And is there a lesson to be learned from these institutions?
No, very true. I often point out to people, Little Xavier University, small, historically Black Catholic university in New Orleans, sends more Black students to medical school every year than all of the Ivy League colleges combined. And when you ask, okay, well, what is Xavier doing? There's an ethos of care in that school and of very high expectations for those students. That's what our students need K-12. They need adults who care about them. They need adults who work with their parents. They need a curriculum that affirms their identity. And they need to be ensured that they can be on a pathway that leads somewhere. And when you look at the schools with the bad outcomes, you see the opposite. And so, you know, again, the state has pursued the wrong policies for too long. You think we've used pressure as a strategy for school improvement. We use threats. We've taken over school districts. I work closely with Inglewood. Inglewood's been under state control now for years. Has the state helped Inglewood to improve? No, because the state does not know what it's doing. And so the state needs to get out of the way, make sure the resources get to schools, but that the resources are directed in ways that actually make a difference for kids.
You bring it up, and then one other recommendation I would have, I'm very fortunate right now in San Lorenzo. I've discovered a place where the educators, at least a number of the educators, have explicit conversation about race and the impact of race on education. That work currently is being guided with the Pacific Educational Group, and I know many of you have read Glenn Singleton and his work. But I'm actually seeing it in practice in terms of the amount of conversation. We're not getting the results that we want, but I think we're in the process of asking the right questions, and that's shying away from race. Race is a part of this, and you know, I look at part of the CSTPs, or the California Standards for the Teaching Profession, as we go into 2021, and there are a couple of them that really highlight, that really should stand out right now. One is the 6.4. I know these were the old ones that might have been rewritten, but same intent. The working with families to support student learning. If we're relying on students to spend now disproportionate to what they were before amount of time at home, then what are we doing to be very intentional and purposeful about developing the relationship with the family? One might argue that we should have been doing that before, and I would agree. But now it's essential that we're working in partnership with the families. So if I'm an educator during the summer, I think I'm asking that question: what am I going to do to really create a strong bond with the family as we try to educate or provide a learning environment for the students? And this is closely related to that other standard, the engaging and supporting all students in learning. What does it say? We need to be connecting learning to students' prior knowledge, backgrounds, life experiences, and interest. That's, you know, I know some educators spend the first week or so really trying to get to know their students. This is going to be extremely complex and necessary as we go into next school year. You got to know everything you can about the students and their families as we get going. Internet access, connectivity, all that interest. And as much as we can do to blend their home environment with what's the learning objective, it's going to be better for our students, because we will be relying on working together in partnership. I see Dr. Noguera, you have.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to caution the listeners out there, educators, I'm so impressed by the number of people who turned out, is to avoid the idea that there's a panacea, that if we just do one thing. I'll tell you right now, I know lots of districts that have done bias training. I know few districts that have improved because of it, okay? Because if you don't connect bias training to how to teach kids to read and do math, then all you do is get a bunch of people pissed off talking about race, and it goes nowhere. Same thing with restorative practices. I support restorative practices, but many people see it as a cookbook recipe and don't realize they only work if you change the relationships between kids and teachers. So we have to be very thoughtful in how we approach this, and not, you know, I always get worried because too often we think there's this quick fix solution. Oh, we'll just do this and it'll solve our problems, and it never does, because we forget you still need strong leadership. You still need to get parents involved. You still need to have teachers who are competent at teaching the content to children. And you still need a culture that affirms the children. If you don't do those things, none of this will work.
So
I
agree.
couldn't agree more. I feel like that's one of the things that we always face when we talk about it. Well, show me a place that's done it. Show me a place that's beaten the odds. Show me a place that's done this, right? And what people are looking for is exactly that. I think, again, people want that silver bullet. What is that one magical thing that's going to transform my school or my classroom or my district? And I think it's really critical and important to take a step back and say there's tons to be learned from places that have done great things to support their students, but it's that holistic process and understanding of how we support ourselves, how we build community, how we build safe spaces in order for that great teaching and learning to actually happen. And I think too often we get to like, what is the tool that you use? What's a data system that you use? What is the, kind of, who did you bring in as a speaker to come in and kind of change everybody's minds about what implicit bias, has an impact on my teaching and learning. And I think it isn't that simple and it isn't that easy. I'd love to hear from, the both of you, especially as Daryl, from you as a practitioner side, and Pedro from you, from your perspective on the research side. What can the state do you think? Like, what is the state's role in this, in providing this kind of support and structure for these complex changes that we're asking of our school systems right now?
You want to take that, Dr. Noguera?
Okay, I could take a start. So, I think the California's made some important steps I want to acknowledge. The LCFF, the local control funding formula, is an equity-based funding plan. It was a mistake not to include Black students as one of the groups in there, but that could be corrected and should be corrected, because across the state we see Black students still lag behind and the resources are not going to them. I also want to say that in addition to the LCFF, I think that creating CCEE has been an important step in California, because now there's an arm that can go out and help schools. So I think we've started the path, but now we have to go further. And I think going further means giving the schools a chance to really learn from each other. We just released this report we focused on the state of Black children in LA County called Beyond the Schoolhouse. And we identified both what's happening in school and outside of school that's producing those poor outcomes for our kids. And then we identified the schools where Black children are thriving. We have to take the educators to see those schools, because if you've never seen it, you know what, after a while you believe the problem is the kids. You believe the problem is their parents. And whenever I go to a school where I hear them blaming the kids or blaming the parents, I know that school never improved, because they don't see what they can do. They don't even know it's possible. They don't realize that if you change the conditions for teaching and learning, you can change the outcome.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I agree. The state has taken some, besides LCFF, the state has done a couple other, passed some other pieces of legislation that have helped the field to change. And another example I have would be the banning of suspending students for defiance or disruption for K through 3. And obviously that's been extended now to the other grade levels. Well, it's forced another conversation. The legislation did not solve the issue, because the issue is our relationships, right? You got to develop relationships. So I think there are some school systems that are saying, well, how can we develop relationships differently than what we did when we were relying on this antiquated system of, okay, kid messes up, send the kid home, even if the kid is homeless, fix the kid and send them back. We've got away from that. We're saying that the best chance of creating a relationship is if we have the student with us. And we need to, build that relationship, keep them in school, because they have a better chance of learning when they are in school. So I think that was another critical component of what the state, candidly as an administrator, I didn't completely like it when it was happening, but I acknowledged that we had an issue, right? There was an issue that needed to be addressed. And I appreciate, in retrospect, I appreciate the conversations that have resulted as a result of that piece of legislation. So I think I do appreciate that. Sujie, did that answer pretty much some of the things that the state could do?
No, yeah, I'll take notes and send that on.
Yeah, I would say that don't minimize too the benefit of collaboration. If we're having candid conversations about the impact of race and on education, then we need people to have different ways of convening. And I think of the 1,000 different school districts. A conversation here in the Bay Area, right outside of Oakland, San Lorenzo, is going to be different than the place where I spent my last 8 years in Stanislaus County. It's different, but the conversation needs to be had no matter what venue, because we have African-American kids, we have Latino kids in certain areas, and I would even argue the white kids that are in predominantly white schools, our schools are segregated, so we have a lot of kids that are whiter in white schools or European-American white schools. Well, those schools need to be having racialized conversations as well. So obviously there's some legislation, actually in the courses that are being approved, there's an ethnic studies course that's being talked about right now. In reality, I think everybody on this call knows that these panelists know that ethnic studies should not be a one course, right, or a semester course. Ethnic studies, well, it should be embedded, right? When you say connecting learning to students' prior knowledge, backgrounds, life experiences, and interests, and knowing that over 50% of our students are Latino across California or Latinx, then it should be embedded in everything we do, everything. I mean, it should not be a separate course, but in absence of, we know the way our curriculum actually plays out in many courses, we have the separate course that's being created for that purpose.
Right. I mean, I think your point about like the collaboration and relationship building is critical, and I think we don't do a good enough job of it, right? Especially where those collaborations and relationships don't naturally exist, right? So, I think about just even what we were talking about earlier with like this. I love, Pedro, what you said, like the ethos of care. I saw it kind of trending for like the hashtag ethos of care piece. I think that's really critical. And how do we learn from places that do that really well, right? So what is that kind of culture of respect and community that our HBCUs are able to like create to really engender this the motivation and the expectations that drive, outcomes that look so vastly different than they do for students of color in other places. I think there's places that we can learn really well from, our charters that I don't think we do a very good enough job of, and reaching out to our charter school, colleagues and collaborate there and learn from the kind of the cultures that some of them have been able to build and develop and really focus on, again, around this, I think, development of community and collaboration, and how can we really learn from spheres that we're not regularly in conversation with.
Can I just elaborate a little bit, because on this issue of bias training, keep this in mind. Many of the police departments where Black people, Latino people, others have been brutalized and killed have had bias training, right? Including Minneapolis. Bias training is not magic, and bias is real, but you can't force the bias out of someone, right? What we have to focus on is understanding how to change practice, change relationships, focus on the context of those relationships if we're going to see a change in outcomes. I see the superintendent is here, so I'll be quiet and let him join us.
And I will be quiet also. I could read the introduction, but I'm just going to say the man that needs no introduction, welcome. And I'm happy that you joined us, Tony Thurmond, our State Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Thank you, Superintendent Camp. And if we've gotten this right, just give me the thumbs up so that we know all the connections have happened. Thank you, sir. I will never be quiet. I will never ask you, Superintendent, to be quiet. I will never ask you, Dr. Noguera, to be quiet. We need to listen to each other and speak with each other. And I believe that what Dr. Noguera was saying is true, that practice has to reflect training and reality. And, we've engaged in a new campaign around implicit bias, but we've also taken the conversation directly to some police organizations and said, listen, a couple of things seem obvious to me. We have to change the way our practices roll out and implement implicit bias training in our state. Right now, our state has what I would call a very limited requirement for just a few hours, and as I understand it, every other year. And so clearly now more than ever, that needs to be systematized and broadened, because some departments do better than others, but we need to make that the practice across the board. I've been grateful to already have some conversations with some of our African-American chiefs and with chiefs and others who have said, you know, we need to use the best practices that make sense around recruitment, around screening, around background checks, and something that seems so obvious. Something that is so obvious that it makes you wonder why it hasn't happened, that we should be checking social media. If any officer is on social media and they are promoting involvement in a neo-Nazi group or a hate group, you know, that is a person who is not appropriate to be in public service. Law enforcement is here to protect us and protect and serve. And I have been grateful to the great conversations we've already begun with some of our chiefs about how we, as Dr. Noguera says, make our practices across the board. And when we see in action, we do something, right? But common sense, they always say to us, if you see something, say something. And if we see someone is availing themselves, they're using their departmental phone, cell phone, their computer to send racist text messages, that is someone who has demonstrated that they cannot protect and serve. And we must have that level of ability to monitor and to intervene. And so we are, in fact, working closely to address the issue of implicit bias. As I have been saying, we are facing two pandemics. We are facing a health-wide pandemic of you know, proportions that go beyond anything that we have ever seen before. And today, you know, the California Department of Education released guidelines for how to help our 1,000 school districts reopen. And we know that it's important for us to maintain 6 feet of distance and for everyone to be wearing face coverings. But we also know that the way our schools reopen can have a disproportionate impact on African-American students and Latinx students and students from low-income communities and students who are the children of essential workers. And so we're having a conversation with all of our districts about how that reopening happens in ways that are safe and that give a nod to the need for equity. I want to thank CAAASA for continuing to promote the conversation about equity. We cannot stop talking about equity just because we're dealing with the pandemic. And anything, we have to accelerate our conversations because we know that our students face disproportionality in the risk factors around who becomes infected by COVID, face disproportionality in their ability to have a computing device at home and to have access to the internet. Many of you know I've launched a statewide task force on closing the digital divide that says we must do better in this state for our kids. And so we are dealing with double pandemics. We're dealing with what I'm now calling a man-made pandemic of racism, where race and bias, not only the interconnection of them impact our students in terms of higher rates of suspension and pushing them out of the classroom, but also, sadly, the likelihood that an African-American person or other oppressed person would fall victim to a police shooting and killing. And these are devastating times. I know you all have heard many of us talking about how devastating George Floyd's killing has been. We have to be open and talk about race and implicit bias in our classrooms. We've launched a campaign to talk about implicit bias in our schools. We're grateful to those who are funding that work, that we have a way to talk about building a training model that schools can use, but we don't want to stop just in education. We are saying that we're going to have conversations in law enforcement, in government, in every sector, because bias exists in every sector. And we have to have those courageous conversations around race, around bias, around building tolerance and partnership across people from all backgrounds. And it starts in our own house. And so for those reasons, I've launched, as we launch this campaign to talk across the entire education sector, I've also announced that we will begin within the California Department of Education, because I believe that we all have to address unconscious bias wherever it exists. And so we're doing it inside out. We're starting with the training within the California Department of Education for our more than 2,500 employees, because we have to role model what we're asking others to do. And we're also having a conversation where I'll be asking all superintendents across the state to engage in a conversation about more implicit bias training. I'll be asking law enforcement leaders across the state and across the country to also engage more directly in implicit bias training. Obviously, we're working on how we accelerate learning at a time when many of our students have experienced learning gaps. And I'm grateful to the works of many partners like EdTrust West and a number of partners who come forward to really talk about the gaps and how our students and families are experiencing distance learning differently. And so more to follow, but I just want to thank CAAASA for its leadership, for its partnership, for the network of leaders. We want to continue to work closely with you. You know, before this, you know, Superintendent Camp, you and I and others have talked about how do we even change recruitment so that we recruit more educators of color. We started an initiative. We've been on panels together where we talked about recruiting more educators of color and male educators of color. We think that now is the time to accelerate that work rather than decelerate it because of the impacts of COVID-19. And so we want to have those conversations. Superintendent Camp, I want your help on how we recruit for every single position that's open, including positions at the California Department of Education, so that we are building that diverse workforce that reflects the diversity of our students, but that we acknowledge that we have lots of great educators from different backgrounds, of all backgrounds, for whom we must all together address our own bias so that we can collectively be better educators and supporters for our students. And so I hope that you all will visit our website and take a look at our reopening guidance. We announced it today. It's not going to surprise you. It says, hey, if we ask our students when they're in the community to wear a facial covering and to maintain 6 feet of distance, why would we treat our schools any different from that? We want our students and our educators to be safe. We've released that guidance, and now we're meeting with different organizations to really break it down and then to work on implementing it together so that by the time school starts in late August and for some September, we've worked through some of the really tough questions about how we're going to make that happen. And so I'm grateful, Superintendent Camp. I'm grateful to you for your leadership. I'm grateful to your panelists. I'm grateful to CAAASA. I'm grateful to CCEE and everyone who is working to ensure that we come together as a sector, because we've never seen anything like this in our lifetimes. And we can do more if we do it together, and we do it with an emphasis on safety and the well-being of our students. And I know some of you may be joining us on our call later today. We're having a call with statewide counseling groups, mental health groups, social emotional support groups, because I'm positing that our key focus has to be safety, dealing with the mental health needs of our students, and how we provide them support. So stay tuned for some updates about the work we're doing to fill gaps there. And I'm grateful for you, Superintendent. Tell me what you need me to do. I'm at your disposal, sir. You tell me how we can be helpful to you, to CAAASA, and to our students across the state.
Gosh, this is just so powerful. And I remember, yeah, you've convened a few task force and meetings. I think it was last April, May, or June. I can't remember, where we talked about recruiting and getting more teachers of color in the field. And then subsequent to that, I wrote an article for the Association of California School Administrators in the Leadership magazine, really asking school districts, and that means every educator that's in the school district, and ask yourself this question: if you were recruiting me, not me, but an African-American male, why would I want to join your school district? Because, and it goes right what Dr. Noguera was saying, and you're saying, Superintendent Thurmond, a lot of our, some of our school districts aren't ready for me, because I'm returning to a place that I'm going to say attempted to ruin my spirit. And then I went to a place where I saw different. I saw more else where my spirit was built up, and it was nurtured, and it was supported and guided. I was fired up about education. And what hurts me is I have a 20-year-old now, and he was in my, he was in my system. So I'm doing some things when I was superintendent, but I saw that I'm seeing that similar experience with him. So I think we have to ask ourselves as educator, and I'm part of this, my team here in San Lorenzo is a part of this. What would we do to nurture and build and to build, strengthen the spirit of students, so they would want to be a part of academia, if you will, in the K through 12 and the higher education system. My own personal student went from, I can't see myself going through 4 more years of this, and now he steps on the Morehouse campus for a couple of years where there's an environment of expectations where he actually says, and candidly, the master's is, I'm going to say, the minimum expectation. I mean, the doctorate is the norm there, and that's what people strive for. You strive for the terminal degrees at Morehouse College. And why? What's everybody else around you's doing it, right? It's a common. So I do think that we need to stay in constant dialogue and don't minimize the convenings. I know the state superintendent is a powerful position, and one of the most powerful tools is to convene people and to stay in dialogue. So, and I know CCEE has been a huge part of that work also, getting people together. And that's why I really appreciate everybody that contributed to this webinar series, over 28 webinars in a few weeks, and they were put together relatively quickly, but with high quality. We had Dr. Noguera and Dr. Ken Wesson that were a part of it, just high quality. So I just want to thank all of our panelists today, the State Superintendent, Dr. Noguera, and Sujie Shin from CCEE. Africa, I know you have a few things to say or maybe questions. We have about 5 minutes, and I know you've been monitoring the chat box also. Dr.
Can I just say one thing? I want you all to think for a moment. If schools were open right now and millions of kids across the state had seen the video of George Floyd murdered, would the schools be prepared to have a conversation with their students about what they had seen?
The answer is no.
Think about, I don't think that, I think most would not. In fact, I've been hearing from principals across the state saying, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say to kids. So we have our work cut out for us.
It's no.
The answer is no. The
And
answer
I
is
think
no.
the critical thing there is, yeah, there's a million no's coming in. I think we know what the answer is. And the thing is, that can't be the reason we shy away from it. We cannot turn our faces to this, right?
That's right.
As the adults in the room are unprepared.
That's true. That's true. I'm gonna be quiet, so because I want to hear from Sister Africa, who's been right oning in I can see her hands up and chatting. But you're absolutely right. Educators often are afraid to talk about race and its impact. We have to create a framework that makes that possible, so that it's safe for honesty, so that we have courageous, honest conversations, and we cannot just assume that people are prepared to do that. We're happy to work with all the panelists here. And with you, Dr. Camp, on how we roll out something to help our districts. Today is our first conversation about dealing with what Dr. Noguera has talked about. Our students have experienced trauma. They've seen this with their own eyes. They have questions about how could this be? They have questions about what this means for their own safety and well-being. And we'll be working with many of our groups, including our Black Association of Psychologists and Black Association of Counselors and Social Workers and others, to work together on how we address this trauma, but how do we also equip our field of educators to be able to responsibly have conversations about race that ultimately support our students and get us to a place where we're preventing these things from happening. So I too am going to be quiet and be humble and listen to our colleague, Africa, who I believe has some things. And so at your disposal.
Well, thank you so much for that. I actually am just going to wrap us up because I'm like, this conversation has been so rich and wonderful, and we're also like a couple of minutes away from the end. So a few things I wanted to say, aside from thank you all so much for everything that you've contributed here. There was up to like 935 participants in the chat, or in the session and also in the chat. So lots going on in there. One of the things that came through was, Tony, when you mentioned that after this meeting that there's going to be another session, there were folks who were interested in how to find the link to that information. And so I'll just say a couple of things and I'll pass it back to you to say, to answer that question. One is that I'm going to drop the link to the survey in the chat so that you'll all be able to give us your feedback. I'll also put the link to the Ask the Experts portal, which will be really key, especially for today's session where there was so many questions that came through that we didn't get a chance to engage with, but that's okay because we have that other opportunity. And then I'll go ahead and add the link to the website where you'll be able to find the resources from today's session, the recording, the slide deck. However, just give a little time because we need time to upload those things. So if it's not there right now, don't be discouraged. Just go, you can go and see other things from other sessions and then just be patient until we get to upload today's. So Tony, would you be able to let folks know how they can access the session you talked about?
Yes, as we're talking, I'm too many phones in front of me trying to figure out, too many devices trying to figure out what the Zoom call is. But what I thought I might do is just say this one email for any of the counseling groups that want to get involved. This will be a first conversation. They can send us a note right now to COVID-19@cde.ca.gov. Again, if you are a counseling group and you want to join this conversation around providing support to our students, both around COVID-19 and reentering our schools, and around the trauma that our students experience around issues around race and racism, COVID-19 at cde.ca.gov. And then also, if you want to contact the staff at CAAASA, I'm sure that they can make a connection. We welcome all of our counseling groups to be a part of that conversation.
Okay, you said COVID-19 at cde.ca.gov?
That's right. Thank you.
I'm about to drop that in the chat in addition to the survey. So that just came through for folks who are looking for the Ask the Experts portal to send your very excellent questions. Please, please do. That link just came through just now. And then the final link that I'll give you is the link to the website, which I know everyone's going to really want, because not only will you have today's resources, but you'll have the archive for all of the sessions that have taken place. And it will also be on the CAAASA website, Dwight just told me. So so definitely you'll be able to stay connected with this information, but we're at time and we definitely want to honor everyone's time, because I know there's other things coming up and you're about to transition to the rest of your day. So thank you so much for being here with us. I wish everyone well. Please take good care of yourselves during these very difficult times, and so glad that we're able to build coalition with one another so we can do transformative things for students and their families that they've always deserved. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Be well.
You too.